Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's a special year-end edition of the France 24 debate as we get set to ring in 2017. We're asking what lessons 1917 can teach us. We're talking with Russian historian, former spokesperson to Mikhail Gorbachev, Andrei Grachev. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Curtis Young, who's preparing a book and an exhibit. We'll talk about it in a moment on the Harlem Hellfighters. We're also with Stephen Clark, his latest book, Merde in Europe, and Stephen Walt, who teaches at Harvard University's Kennedy School. Thank you for joining us again from Boston. 1917, the United States enters World War I, and there's this unit of soldiers that we don't hear too much about.
You don't.
And yet they played a key role in, you might say, in the civil rights movement.
These guys, this unit won 171 Legion d'Honneur. The entire unit, they were the first unit to earn the Croix de Guerre, and the entire unit won the Croix de Guerre.
Yeah.
At the end of the war...
War Cross Medal, which is...
At the end of the war, the French command...
Yeah, we're looking at some of these pictures there. You can see of the...
These guys, they were... When he was very important. That's Henry Johnson that you just looked at, who just received posthumously the Congressional Medal of Honor 2 years ago. When the war started, America didn't have an army large enough to send to France. And so Wilson immediately asked Congress for the right to the Selective Service Act. With the Selective Service Act, all men in America, 21 to 31, had to sign up. This for these black men who were just 54 years out of slavery was an opportunity for them to show their loyalty to America. They weren't, however, allowed to engage in combat. They were put into a special unit called the SOS, the Supply of Service, and they came to Europe as workers. These are the guys who unloaded the ships, who built the roads, who buried the dead, et cetera, et cetera. The French had been waiting for replacements, 14, 15, 16, now 17, 4 years, Verdun, huge losses. And Pershing said no replacements. And at a certain point, General Pétain asked Pershing for these black men. Reluctantly, Pershing loaned them, and they were integrated into the 4th French Army under General Henri Gouraud. And they did a marvelous job. They were honored by the French. And when the war was over, the Americans told these guys, don't wear your uniforms, because this idea of having black soldiers in America was anathema. In fact, 1919 is known in history as Red Summer because of the lynchings and the violence against these soldiers when they returned home, because America was...
They got a hero's welcome in New York City.
They created a hero's welcome in New York City. They weren't allowed to parade. They created their own parade, and they marched up Fifth Avenue. They marched from 34th Street up to Harlem, and it was the biggest parade after the war. But these guys created it, and there it is. They were known as the Harlem Hellfighters. My lapsus was because they were known as the Blutstrucker, the Schwarzen Blutstrucker, by the Germans because of the efforts of Needham Roberts and Henry Johnson, who we just saw his photo, who fought off a German unit with such efficiency that the German says these guys are the black bloodsuckers, and the French call them the Hellfighters, and that's the name that stuck with them up until today.
And we in this country have them to thank for introducing jazz music.
They brought they had James Reese Europe was one of the most noted musicians in New York at the time, and he created a band. And when they came off of the ship in Brest, January 1st, 1918, they lined up on the docks and they played the Marseillaise in ragtime. Mm-hmm. France had never heard this before. And they went on a tour, ending up in Aix-sur-Bain. And they, in fact, exactly. And they finally had a concert at Champs-Élysées, and the president, Raymond Poincaré, was there. And at the end of the war, one of these men, Eugene Bullard, who was not part of the 369th, but had been in the French Foreign Legion and a pilot, opened up the first nightclub in Montmartre in 1920. And the thing about this important in the context of our show today is that these guys, in their relationship with French soldiers, black guys from Harlem, French guys from Provence, who were operating underneath the meta-narrative, were just coming together, and they created a cultural moment that exists until today.
It's a moment of globalization in a sense, done thanks to this horrible thing called World War I. But Stephen Clark, when we see that those who are in contact with others, like the City of London, which voted against Brexit, they're the ones least afraid of meeting other people and of the immigrants that you described.
Yeah,
earlier.
you would hope so, although at the moment in London there have been outbreaks of anti-Polish, anti-Czech, anti-EU graffiti and violence since Brexit. The xenophobes have come out of the closet, encouraged by certain newspapers. Meeting people from other cultures opens your minds to other cultures. That's for sure. It's just a shame that in the First World War, these people were brought from a hell of a long way away to fight in the mud in France from all over the British Empire as well. There were lots of African soldiers, Indian soldiers who were brought in to fight, and who didn't really get much acclaim for that after. Britain didn't sort of suddenly free its colonies out of gratitude.
That's interesting. Unsung heroes when it comes to the colonized coming to fight in World War I. Unsung heroes as well in 1917 meant women in factories back home and on picket lines in Britain and in the United States protesting for the right to vote. Like suffragist Alice Paul, who you see here in this photo. She went to jail for her convictions. Yet, Stephen Walt, we don't talk about that much today, do we?
No, we don't. And one of the things I think we see in many societies, certainly true in the United States, is that in moments of national emergency, when people feel the security of the country is really at risk, then we are much more open to the idea of bringing all members of the society in for the common effort. What you see throughout American history is, voting expands when there's a sense of national emergency, when the country is at war. And I think we saw that again throughout the 20th century. And then, of course, when the Cold War comes along, you see the same thing, the gradual expansion of civil rights in the United States, a process that is still underway. What I find really striking about the story that Curtis told, which is really a fascinating one, is how it echoes with some of what we're dealing with today in the United States and elsewhere. If you recall the discussion from our first segment about the lack of a sort of bright utopian futures now, what's interesting about the, let's call them quasi-ideologies that are now emerging, is how nostalgic they are. Instead of looking forward, they are looking backwards. When Donald Trump says he's going to make America great, he says make America great again, as if we're going to go back to some earlier period that was wonderful and idyllic. Similarly, the people who voted for Brexit, I think, were voting in part for a return to an idealized image of what England might have been 20, 30, 50, 80, 100 years ago. These are not movements that are pointing us forward. They're, to some degree, movements that are pointing us backwards. And part of that, of course, is going to be then trying to suppress groups that have different cultural backgrounds, different heritages, that in some way are different from that idealized image that is being used to at least persuade some people to buy into particular political movements.
Of course, the same can be said of today's Russia. It was interesting to hear Vladimir Putin during his State of the Nation address, sort of a bit of an ambivalence, because 1917 is going to be the year of commemorations of the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And this is what he talked about when he talked about the need to preserve national unity.
It is unacceptable to drag the division, anger, offense and stubbornness of the past into our present life, and to speculate on tragedies that affected every Russian family, personally and politically, independent of which side their ancestors fought on. We must remember that we are a united people and that there is only one Russia.
What does he mean exactly?
Well, it's a great paradox of today's Russia because exactly as you said, as Eric Hobsbawm...
Because I can't tell if he wants to hark back to this golden age that Stephen Walt was describing, how it was much better in the past, or if he's saying don't look back too much.
No, it's. I would say it's more complex because, well, after all, let's not forget, 1917 marks the Bolshevik Revolution. Revolution that was oriented to the future. And it not only of Russia's future, but world's future at that time. Now, 100 years later, we are witnessing Russia that is proposing to a world a kind of a conservative revolution, a revolution which is oriented to the past, with the appeal of Putin to go back either to the memory of the Soviet Union and its methodology of governing the society, or even to the previous stage of it, Russian Empire or something of this. So from this point of view, Russia represents a society that, from my point of view, even if Putin, in a way, reproduces Trump's formula. Trump is speaking about making America great again. Putin is speaking about Russia rising from its knees. So
yeah, it's implicit when he talks about his greater Russia concept.
At the same time, if each country seeks for itself its own way of making itself great, that announces clashes. That brings us, unfortunately, to this dark era that, after all, provoked this terrible clash of the First World War. And, by the way, let's not forget, Woodrow Wilson and Lenin, almost simultaneously at that time, are recalling and reminding the horrors of the First World War, believing in a possibility of ending all wars and proposing to the world a new world order that would be just and peaceful.
All right, so if everybody's harking back and everyone's a nationalist, that's a recipe for danger. Professor Walt, your book, The Origins of Alliances, you talk about something called a balance of threat. Can you explain what that is? And do you have a balance of threat if everyone is playing the nationalist?
Well, the basic idea is that states form alliances primarily in response to external threats. And the external threats they perceive are a function of the power of potential rivals, also how close they are, geographically proximate, and whether or not the rivals appear to be particularly dangerous or have particularly aggressive intentions. So the more powerful a rival, the closer it is, the more hostile its aim seems to be, the more likely other states are to then form alliances against it. I think if you look at the present world, actually, what's paradoxical in many respects is that the level of danger faced certainly by the United States, but also by many others, is far less than at other points in time. Certainly far less than it was in the run-up to World War I. The great tragedy there being that all of these competing powers were actually very worried about one another, and countries like Wilhelmine Germany were deeply concerned about the rising power of Russia. Today, I don't think we face any situation quite like that. The United States is still, I think, the world's wealthiest and most powerful country, and extraordinarily secure here in the Western Hemisphere, with no powerful enemies nearby. We are somewhat concerned with the rising power of China, but it is not yet a peer competitor. It poses no imminent threat to the United States. And even in Europe, where people are concerned, I think, about Russia and concerned about the situation in Ukraine and elsewhere, it's not the case that Russia, to me, is a revanchist power that threatens to dominate Europe, or that Europe cannot ultimately deal with primarily with its own resources. There are problems in many parts of the world, most notably the Middle East, but these are not the kind of problems that are going to provoke, powerful, cohesive alliances. And that's, of course, what we've been talking about, is that there is no longer the same sense of unity in the West that you saw during the Cold War, or I would argue unity in some other places in response to the United States.
So
and
not being locked into alliances is a good thing, is what you're saying.
Well, it has paradoxical effects. On the one hand, it means greater political division. We have more difficulty reaching agreement, and you see the centrifugal forces within the European Union, I think, are partly a function of the fact that there is no longer a common danger to provide an additional impetus for European unity. But on the other hand, it also does give individual countries somewhat greater latitude to pursue their own interests.
Stephen Clark, the important point there by Stephen Walt, which is that we have a world that's safer, yet in the period of rolling news channels like France 24, it can seem more dangerous, because if you have the same image of a bomb exploding every 20 minutes.
Well, it's true. It's not. It's less about big battles now than terrorism, which of course in the age of modern media is a much more efficient tool because you can terrorize everybody within seconds. And also, it's true, maybe Europe has got complacent, which is why so many people seem to want to leave the EU. It seems to be sort of grinding to a halt almost in its ideals. People don't realize that the ideals that the EU wanted to set out, which were not only political or peace, but also, good water, good air, good working conditions. They've sort of more or less been achieved, clean food and all that. The EU has done a lot of its work. And now people are saying, well, what's the point of it? And maybe, if Lithuania does get, Lithuania's reintroduced national service. They're scared of being invaded. If the Baltic states get invaded, then maybe people in the EU will wake up and think, well, maybe there is a danger now. But it's true, in Europe anyway, people probably have got complacent and just think that, there's no real threat to us anymore.
Are we the victims of our success?
Yes. Yes, and the reason I say that is because what we've been discussing are a range of alliances that reflect an old world order. I can't help but think about a photograph that I once saw of King George and Tsar Nicholas together. They're twins. These are the same families.
They were cousins.
They were exactly.
The Kaiser was a cousin as well. It was all about
there you
cousins,
have it. So there were these close alliances. This whole idea of nationalism was a relatively new idea out of the late 19th century. But what's going on today is something else. There are these anti-systemic movements that are going on that are represented with Brexit, Trump, the alternative for Deutschland in Germany, the 5-star. On the Front National here in France. These are movements that seem like political parties, but they're, for example, Trump. Trump is a movement. That's not a political party. He hijacked the Republican Party as a vehicle for his movement. These are movements that are made up of workers. A lot of these workers are unemployed workers, petty bourgeois shopkeepers, retired people, this sort of thing.
But middle-class people voted for him too.
But these are people who this old world order has left behind. That's why I brought up this idea of neoliberalism, that people are reacting against this and saying, and watching all of these guys connected with Wall Street or Brussels, and leaving people behind. So one of the things I think that we need to look at is for me, this is more not 1917 to 2017. This is 1848 again in terms of the revolutions that were going on around at that same moment. So this is something I think we need to look at.
Yeah, going back to a question about alliances. Well, I'm afraid to say that looking back into history, we discover that in order to build an alliance, you need a common threat, a common enemy. You've had anti-Hitler coalition that was built largely by Hitler, that could bring together very different countries and very efficient coalition. And then you had NATO and maybe let's say, unification of Europe that was built largely against the supposed Soviet threat, which is no more there. So, well, bin Laden is no more to replace the former Soviet Union. Do we need an external enemy, a threat? I know from Gorbachev that during their first meeting in Geneva with Ronald Reagan, At the end of conversation, Reagan asked him, Mr. General Secretary, Gorbachev was not yet president at that time, in case our country is attacked by the extraterrestrials, shall you support us? And Gorbachev said, yes, without any doubt. So do we wait for the extraterrestrials to give us reason for uniting while we're having terrible challenges with the, I'm afraid to say that, witnessing the possible collapse of what we are calling the globalization, which is certainly not a globalization heureuse. It's not a happy globalization, but at least it is perceived by many as a dangerous globalization. So why not to react to it?
Stephen Walt, again, it's about perception. Are we in a happy or an unhappy globalization when you hear Curtis Young talking about all those forgotten by it?
Well, you can point to all sorts of disturbing aspects to it, and at the same time, there are benefits to globalization. You know, 1 to 2 billion people around the world have been elevated out of abject poverty over the past 20 to 30 years, and that is at least partly because of the spreading of global markets. What I wanted to emphasize was that, you know, as history proceeds, it's partly a matter of large structural forces like the spread of markets and things like that, but it's also specific leadership decisions, specific choices that people made that were not necessarily inevitable. And if you looked at the last 25 years and you imagine a few leaders making a different decision, if the Bush administration had decided not to go into Iraq in 2003, if they had paid a little bit more attention to what was happening on Wall Street and we had avoided the 2008 financial crisis, if Prime Minister Cameron had not decided to put the Brexit matter up for a referendum, which is something he did not have to do, did it as a result of some internal dealings in the Conservative Party. And I could go on and on. There were specific political choices that leaders have made that have brought us to this position. It was not, it seems to me, inevitable that we would have had the same crisis in the contemporary world order that many of us now perceive, and that has allowed movements like the Trump phenomenon and like some of the other developments in Europe to take place now. So it's some blend of large structural forces, but also individual leadership choices, and I would argue an absence of serious statecraft, serious and disciplined leadership in many countries around the world.
Leadership, so important. In 1914, it's the shooting of Archduke Ferdinand that sets in motion all these alliances that were locked into one another. You hear Stephen Walt talk about Brexit. Is it a Sarajevo moment?
So, I hope not. Well, the thing about Sarajevo is that in fact, the heir to the throne who was killed was actually a sort of fairly meaningless person. Because he'd already been disowned by his father, the Emperor of Austro-Hungary. His children had been cut off because he was considered a very bad heir, and there was actually a younger, much better heir waiting in the wings. So this Sarajevo moment, it was in fact a sort of false moment in history. I know this because I wrote a biography of King Edward VII of Britain, who only reigned for 10 years, but he spent almost the whole of his reign, because he was the uncle of the Kaiser, he was the uncle of the Tsar. He was the father of the future King of England, you know. He was a friend for Emperor Joseph of Austria. He spent all of his reign going around, smoking cigars and drinking champagne with these people, saying sort of, calm down, we don't want a war. We don't want a war. And when he died in 1910...
So it could have come sooner.
It could have come much sooner, because the Kaiser was going around, was provoking France and trying to get an alliance with Britain and failing to do it, and trying to get an alliance with Russia and failing to do it as well. And King Edward VII was actually keeping the situation calm. And when he died, the French then said, Raymond Poincaré gave a beautiful speech about Edward VII saying, the great European peacemaker is dead, now there will probably be war. And so it was a moment when, one, it's true what you say about needing leadership. He's not at all recognised, Edward VII, but in fact, in a sort of low-key way, he was keeping the peace throughout Europe because they were all his friends and cousins.
To answer Stephen Walt's question, why is good leadership so hard to find?
Exactly, yeah. What you need is someone with a sort of vision to do this. I mean, Edward VII was doing it mainly because he loved going to casinos and spas and things all over Europe. He didn't want there to be a war. And he could have warned these people. He probably did say, if we have a war, you're going to lose your empire. In the whole of Europe, the only empire that came out of it was Britain, and the only monarchy that came out of it was Britain. The Kaiser went, the Tsar went, the Austro-Hungarians went. It didn't take someone with vision, leadership, to sort of keep the peace. These days, it doesn't seem to be around.
All right, that is certainly one lesson that 1917 or 1914 can teach us about today. Stephen Clark, I want to thank you. I want to thank Andrei Grachev. I want to thank Curtis Young. Stephen Walt for joining us from Boston. Thank you for joining us here for this special year-end edition of the France 24 debate.